The press conference that we've called here is about the intention to prosecute Canadian officials for aiding and abetting Israel's war crimes. So our first speaker today is Shane Martinez. Shane is a lawyer with ICJP, Canada's legal working group for Canadian accountability. Welcome, Shane.
Thank you very much, Bianca, and thank you to my fellow panelists this morning as well. Today, we're announcing an important initiative being taken by the International Center for Justice for Palestinians and specifically by the ICJP's Legal Working Group for Canadian Accountability. The International Center for Justice for Palestinians is an independent organization of lawyers, politicians, and academics who support the rights of Palestinians and aim to protect their rights through the law. The ICJP's work includes, but is not limited to, holding the Israeli government and its military apparatus and supporters to account for violations of international law and coordinating litigation aimed at protecting and promoting the human rights of Palestinians. Today, we serve notice on Prime Minister Trudeau, as well as on the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Minister of National Revenue, and the Attorney General. In that notice, we encourage the Attorney General to investigate and prosecute Canadian officials where there is evidence of their involvement in offenses under Canada's Crimes Against Humanity and War Crimes Act. While we ourselves cannot initiate investigations or prosecutions at the International Criminal Court, our notice informed the Canadian government of our intent to share the evidence that we are compiling with the Office of the Prosecutor at the ICC. It also provided notice that we intend to share the evidence with third-party state signatories to the Rome Statute and encourage an independent investigation and prosecution of Canadian officials who have aided, abetted, or otherwise assisted Israel's commission of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Over the last 40 days, Israel's collective punishment of the people of Gaza has known no limits. Since October the 8th, Israel has imposed a total siege on Gaza, cutting off its electricity, fuel, water, and food supplies, and preventing access to any meaningful humanitarian aid, including medicine and medical supplies. The withholding of food, water, and other basic necessities from civilian populations during international armed conflicts is expressly forbidden under international humanitarian law and amounts to war crimes and crimes against humanity under the Rome Statute. On October 13th, Israel's president, Isaac Herzog, cast blame for the October 7th attacks on all Palestinians in Gaza. On November 10th, Prime Minister Netanyahu vowed that Israel will militarily control Gaza. And 2 days later, Avi Dichter, Israel's Minister for Agriculture and a member of the War Cabinet, publicly stated that Israel was rolling out the Gaza Nakba. This has led some of the most respected human rights authorities at the United Nations and elsewhere to call Israel's assaults on Gaza war crimes, a textbook case of genocide, and ethnic cleansing. The evidence is overwhelming. Israel has systematically continued to bomb Gaza with widespread and indiscriminate airstrikes, destroying thousands of civilian homes and killing over 11,100 people, including over 4,600 children. At least 198 medical staff and 42 journalists have also been killed. Over 2,700 people remain missing under the rubble. There are credible reports on Israel's use of white phosphorus munitions against the civilian population in Gaza, and Israel's armed forces have bombed the Al-Maghazi, Jabalia, and Barej refugee camps, killing hundreds, including entire families. And yesterday, we saw Israeli troops invade the Al-Shifa hospital, the same hospital where multiple premature babies died after 39 of them had to be removed from incubators once there was no longer any fuel to keep them running. Let there be no mistake. We are witnessing a genocide unfold before our eyes. The government of Canada is well aware that Israel's relentless attacks on the people of Gaza have included numerous serious breaches of international criminal law, international humanitarian law, and international human rights law. Yet Prime Minister Trudeau has done little more than offer hollow statements expressing concern and calling for humanitarian pauses to war crimes while continuing to support and enable Israel's armed forces. This cruel contradiction has left Canada's global reputation in tatters. The Government of Canada has facilitated arms exports, economic support, and military assistance for Israel. The Minister of Foreign Affairs has refused to cancel permits for arms exports to Israel in accordance with her responsibilities under Canada's Export and Import Permits Act and the UN's Armed Trade Treaty, thereby allowing explosives, missile components, and other armaments to be provided to Israel at this time. The Minister of National Revenue has allowed Canadian charities to funnel millions of dollars in donations to subsidize the operations of Israel's armed forces, contrary to the policy of the Canada Revenue Agency. And the Director of Public Prosecutions has taken no action to enforce the Foreign Enlistment Act to halt the recruitment of Canadians to enlist or accept other voluntary engagements in Israel's armed forces. Taken as a whole, the law does not seem to apply in Canada, where Israel's military is concerned. The positions taken by the Canadian state must not be confused for ignorance or cowardice. These positions are well-calculated foreign policy positions. This is not a failure to act, but rather a refusal. And while the refusal of the Canadian government to rise to the occasion is shameful for Canadians, it is deadly for the Palestinian people. As such, there is no time to spare. Our initiative is novel, and it's not without challenges, but we're committed to pursuing and creatively developing it with our international partners in an effort to hold Canadian officials accountable. Thank you very much, and I'll now turn the mic over to my colleague, Asif Rashid.
Thank you, Shane.
Thank you, Shane. Go ahead, Asif.
I also like to thank my fellow panelists. It is important to recognize where the impetus for application of international law is actually coming from. It is people in Gaza, the West Bank, and around the world that have demonstrated more concern for international law and applying it to Israel than states have. Throughout the world, millions have gathered to demand a ceasefire, an end to the siege on Gaza, and accountability for Israel and its supporters to international law. In this context, legal actions to hold allies of Israel liable for complicity can lead to justice. And as the slogan goes, no justice, no peace. Some highlights from just the US and Canada. In New York City, several thousands of people have gathered on numerous occasions as the atrocities at the hands of Israel and its chief supporter, the United States, have continued to pile up. Grand Central Station has been shut down more than once. In Washington, D.C. on November the 5th, tens of thousands gathered in the largest ever showing of solidarity for Palestinian people in the capital. There have been protests at U.S. ports in Tacoma in Washington State on November the 7th and Oakland, California on November the 3rd to attempt to block shipment of arms for Israel. Over two-thirds of people polled in the U.S. are calling for a ceasefire, and while being ignored by their government, escalating protests have been increasing pressure on the U.S. government to stop its complicity. In Canada, twice in the last couple of weeks, hundreds of thousands have gathered in actions across the country calling for an immediate ceasefire, ending the siege on Gaza, and accountability of Canada for its support of Israel while it commits atrocities against Palestinians. There were sit-ins at 17 MPs' offices on or around October 30th, a number likely to have grown since then, with one at Justin Trudeau's office on November the 10th. On October 30th, Canadian security and defense manufacturer Incas, based in Toronto, a company identified as producing armored vehicles and more for the Israeli military, was picketed, creating a disruption in their business as usual. Regarding state parties, buoyed by international solidarity for Palestinian people, several countries have taken steps towards recognizing Israel's violations of international law by either recalling their ambassador or cutting diplomatic ties, or both. Bolivia, South Africa, Jordan, Turkey, Chile, Colombia, Honduras, Belize, Chad, and Bahrain have done so, and that list is likely to grow. Through such action, these countries have issued moral condemnation against Israel for its atrocities against Palestinians, something entirely lacking by Canada. On November 11th, at a conference of the Arab League and Organization of Islamic Cooperation, there was a proposal to cut all ties with Israel, including demands to freeze all diplomatic and economic contacts with Israel. while failing to agree to cutting ties, the final statement from the conference called on all countries to stop exporting weapons and ammunition to Israel, used by their army and settlers to kill Palestinian people and destroy civilian infrastructure. Canada is one of the countries to whom this call applies. But a call has little meaning if not followed by action. Support provided to perpetrators of international crimes can be investigated and prosecuted by the International Criminal Court and third states under the principle of universal jurisdiction. Universal jurisdiction holds that some crimes, such as genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes, are so egregious that they are an issue for the international community. The suspect or victim does not have to be a citizen of the state exercising universal jurisdiction, and the crime does not have to directly harm the state's national interests. Universal jurisdiction applies to Canada's support of Israel's armed forces, where there is demonstrable evidence that the international crimes may have already been committed, and clear evidence that further crimes against civilians will imminently be perpetrated. As has been outlined by my colleague, Mr. Martinez, there is evidence of aiding and abetting by Canada. The Legal Working Group for Canadian Accountability will be collecting further evidence. Canada and other allies of Israel have been put on notice. On the 2nd of November 2023, a group of 8 UN experts who form the special procedures of the Human Rights Council released a statement which reads in part, "We remain convinced that the Palestinian people are at grave risk of genocide. The time for action is now. Israel's allies also bear responsibility and must act now to prevent its disastrous course of action. This applies to Canada, which must act now." Under Article 25 of the Rome Statute, individual criminal responsibility attaches not only to the direct perpetrators of crimes, but also to those who aid, abet, or otherwise assist in the commission of a crime within the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, or ICC. Aiding and abetting requires practical assistance, encouragement, or moral support, which has a substantial effect on the perpetration of the crime. As my colleague Mr. Martinez has noted, there is already a record of financial and military aid by Canada to Israel and recruitment to the Israeli military from Canada. An individual who provides support for the commission of a crime does not have to be in the territory where the ICC has jurisdiction for liability for aiding and abetting. Furthermore, the ICC Appeals Chamber has found that there is no head of state immunity under customary international law in international courts. Expressions of concern or calls for so-called humanitarian pauses by government officials are insufficient if Canada's actions give encouragement and material support for those committing atrocities in Gaza. In order to reduce the risk of further complicity, the Government of Canada must immediately take the following diplomatic and economic measures. 1. Call for a ceasefire to prevent further loss of life in Gaza. 2. Call for secure provision of meaningful humanitarian aid to Gaza. 3. Issue a public statement condemning Israel's breaches of international law. 4. Insist that Israel fully comply with international law. 5. Cancel all Canadian permits for arms exports to Israel. 6. Prosecute those recruiting Canadian volunteers for Israel's armed forces. And 7. Prevent Canadian charities from using donations to benefit Israel's armed forces. Finally, we wish to emphasize that Canada agreed to pursue the implementation of the principle of responsibility to protect at the UN 2005 World Summit, and again committed to doing so at the UN General Assembly's 64th plenary meeting in 2021. Canada has acknowledged that it has, quote, the responsibility to use appropriate diplomatic, humanitarian, and other peaceful means to help protect populations from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity, end quote. Genocide overrides all other considerations, and there are immediate obligations which arise when an alert on genocide is raised, as it has been in this case. Canada, as a contracting party to the Genocide Convention, is obliged under Article 1 of the Convention to take measures to end and prevent genocide. This includes, but is not limited to, calling for a ceasefire. I turn it now over to Tayeb Ali, Director of the ICJP.
Thank you very much, Asaf and Shane, and thank you all for inviting me to come and speak at your press conference in Canada. I'm Tayeb Ali. I'm speaking from London. I'm the founder and director of the International Centre of Justice for Palestinians, or ICJP. The idea for the ICJP started with an analysis that a major contributing factor to the cycle of violence that we see in Palestine and Israel was the asymmetrical relationship between Israel and Palestine, and the lack of a rules-based accountability system which is applied equally to both Israelis and Palestinians. The asymmetrical relationship between Israel and Palestine is a creation of the international community by gifting Israel impunity from its many, many recorded violations of international law. The lack of an accountability system is also gifted to Israel by the international community. The framework that I talk about in a rules-based accountability system is not something alien or unknown or something new that needs to be written. The framework was developed after the atrocities of World War II and the genocide of 6 million Jews by Nazi Germany. That framework is the framework of international humanitarian law that was created at the end of World War II. A framework that politicians around the globe understand only too well and can apply when their political will suits them to. So an example for that is the huge movement of political will to prevent Russian war crimes in the Ukraine. An example in the Ukraine of how when the international community wants to, it can implement that accountability framework almost instantly and effectively to a degree where even in a war zone and during a war, it can arrest, prosecute and convict war criminals where it applies that accountability framework appropriately. With regards to Israel, it's also not something unknown, but I did hear Shane say that it was novel, and that's part of the tragedy here because it shouldn't be novel. In 2009, I was one of the leading lawyers with a group in London that managed to apply for an arrest warrant for Tzipi Livni, the Foreign Minister of Israel, or former Foreign Minister of Israel, for her part in the attack on a police station in Gaza, a civilian target. And a British court, following the presentation of evidence about that particular allegation, issued an arrest warrant for the arrest of Tzipi Livni. That arrest warrant was passed to the police, and the police pursued a suspect that they considered to be Tzipi Livni in London. What transpired was that the UK government blocked the arrest of Tzipi Livni by issuing an immunity certificate. And that, interestingly, immunity certificate is still in place to this day. And interestingly, the arrest warrant is still in place to this day. But imagine just for a moment what would have happened if the United Kingdom government had not protected a suspected war criminal. And imagine if the allegations that were made against Tzipi Livni in relation to civilian attacks in Gaza in 2009 in Operation Cast Lead had actually been tried in a British court, and a jury had made a decision as to whether Tzipi Livni had in fact committed war crimes or in fact was innocent of them. We may be in a very different place today. That process of accountability may have made Israel think twice about the huge response to the October 7th attack that it's currently pursuing now. The attack on October the 7th was clearly atrocious and heinous, and where actors on the October the 7th attack acted outside the law, those individuals should be brought before the same accountability system. ICJP believes that the rules-based accountability system should be applied both to Israelis and Palestinians. And that's the problem, because it's clearly not being applied to Israelis at the moment. There is significant evidence that Israel has engaged in war crimes since October the 7th. Just the simple statistics of 11,500 Palestinians dead, 4,500 of them being children, and 1,500 million of a 2.2 million population displaced is evidence in its own right of an attack that doesn't target, have distinction or proportionality. We at the ICJP were not only concerned about the actions of Israel, but we became hugely concerned that Israel was being encouraged by politicians, not only in the United Kingdom, but across the globe, to pursue its relentless, its unlawful attack on Palestinians in a position of collective punishment. And what we decided to do was that to write to politicians in the United Kingdom and remind them in the first instance that the international humanitarian law was something that they needed to respect and they needed to enforce on Israel to also respect. The position with that was that on immediately receiving notifications of prosecution from the ICJP, some politicians in the United Kingdom changed their rhetoric. And this is really important because, as you heard from Asaf, Article 25 of the Rome Statute attaches criminal liability to those that aid and abet and encourage war crimes. They have the same liability as somebody that actually carries that liability, that issue out. And the lawyers at ICJP determined that the fact that we had managed to get an arrest warrant for Zippy Livni back in 2009 meant that we now had suspects who were complicit in war crimes present in our parliament in the United Kingdom. We had commentators of the television who were complicit in war crimes and encouraging war crimes present in the United Kingdom. No longer did we need to apply principles of universal jurisdiction as we did in 2009, but we could actually prosecute these politicians, these commentators, these supporters of war crimes in England. This is what we are determined to do. We have a very straightforward, very simple strategy with regards to what we're doing. ICJP is engaged on a Justice for Gaza campaign. That campaign, that project, involves collating evidence from the ground in Gaza, putting that evidence into order, understanding that evidence, drafting complaints to law enforcement agencies in London, Scotland Yard, and providing those complaints with that evidence to law enforcement agencies here present in the United Kingdom. It's not our job to do this. It's not the job of Asaf or Shane or myself to do this. But where our international community, where governments and where law enforcement agencies fail to live up to the responsibilities under international humanitarian law, we have to step into that place, and we're determined to do that. Our first step is to get local law enforcement agencies in the United Kingdom and each jurisdiction around the world to do their job to investigate and prosecute suspected war criminals in their jurisdiction. If local law enforcement agents are not prepared to do that, we, where possible, will apply for private arrest warrants, as we did successfully in 2009, to pursue those politicians and those commentators and those perpetrators directly. We will also refer and provide our evidence to the International Criminal Court for Karim Khan, the ICC prosecutor, to investigate and prosecute individuals. But that's not where we will stop. We are committed to making sure that our evidence packets and complaints will be delivered to every single law enforcement agency in every single country across the globe, in the hope that some law enforcement agencies will live up to their responsibilities and not only investigate and pursue and prosecute Israeli suspected war criminals, but British, French, German, Canadian, American suspected war criminals, wherever they might be. We cannot allow politicians and commentators to think that their complicity in war crimes ends when they leave office. ICJP is determined to make sure that the criminal acts of politicians and commentators follows them until we achieve accountability. Thank you.
My apologies. Thank you. Thank you so much to Tayyab, who is the director of the International Center for Justice for Palestinians and a partner at Weinmann's LLP. So we're now going to take a little pause because I do see that there are quite a few journalists here from across Canada and beyond. So if anyone would like to ask a question, you can raise your hand or message me. Just let me know what your media outlet is. We'll also be taking questions at the end, and I can unmute you and allow you to pose your question. I do see a question here from Paul Salvatore at TRT. I'm just going to unmute you, Paul, and you can ask your question. Paul, are you able to hear me? All right. Well,
Yes. Am
yes,
I
please
coming
go
through
ahead.
now? Okay. Okay. So thank you so much for the presentation. I'm just wondering if anyone can speak to whether Canada can be legally held accountable for its failure to intervene on top of facilitating Israeli war crimes or failing to intervene to protect Palestinians specifically, and also whether the action would apply to Israeli crimes prior to October 7. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Paul.
Yeah.
Would anyone like to take this, Shane?
I can maybe address the second part of the question. So yes, I think Canada could be held responsible for crimes which have occurred in which it's been complicit, prior to October 7th of this year. The investigation into the situation in Palestine that's happening at the ICC right now is one that dates back to 2014. And so the Office of the Prosecutor there has prosecutorial jurisdiction over crimes that are committed in Gaza and the West Bank since then and going forward as well. And that's been stated quite clearly. In terms of whether or not Canada can be held accountable for failing to intervene, there's certainly a duty to intervene. How to hold Canada to account to meet its international legal obligations as a contracting party to the Genocide Convention and other agreements is a bit of a more complex question. But it certainly does have those obligations.
I could perhaps add to that regarding what Shane was just talking about. I guess that would be the first part of Mr. Salvatore's question. There is a Crimes Against Humanity and War Crimes Act, and in that act, we're looking into this, but there is the provision that a military commander or a superior has a duty to act, and if they fail to take as soon as practical all necessary and reasonable measures within their power to prevent or repress the commission of an offense or the further commission of offenses, then accountability is possible. Or if they fail to take action as soon as practicable, all necessary and reasonable measures within their power to submit the matter to competent authorities, then it's possible that liability could be found. We're looking into this.
Can
I just follow up on that before turning it over to see if the other panelists have something to add as well. Canada and Israel have a very strong military working relationship under an agreement that's called the Canada-Israel Strategic Partnership. It's very high level, very comprehensive military engagement between the two countries. So that is something that needs to be looked at as well, and further information needs to be collected on to see exactly what the role of Canada's military has been behind the scenes during what we've seen since October 7th, but also prior to that.
Do you mind if I just comment on that? In what ICJP is really focused on at the moment, and our primary concern is complicity in international crimes and war crimes. And that can be formulated in a number of different ways in terms of encouraging, where politicians are saying, Israel has the unequivocal right to self-defense. In other words, it can do whatever it likes, notwithstanding the fact that Netanyahu, as well as other senior politicians, are speaking in genocidal terms with some of the remarks that they're making by making the fault of what's happened on October 7th, all the Palestinians, or inciting ideas of Amalek, and what should be done to them in the Netanyahu speech, so religious scripture. What's important here is that if Canada as a state is sending armaments and weaponry to Israel with the knowledge that those armaments and weaponry are to be used in war crimes, then the individuals in the Canadian government that have made those decisions and supported that action become individually liable for that action. And that would be from any single person who provides material support. And so that's from the head of state all the way down to through the military, all the way through the cabinet, all the way through the military infrastructure. But what's really interesting is that it also applies to individuals lower down in the chain of command, including people that maybe fill the vehicles that were petrol or diesel or fuel to fly the plane across, they also, if they have the knowledge that the weaponry that they're assisting to transport could be used for war crimes, become individually and independently liable for that action. And you've heard the sort of adage which is following orders is no excuse. And what that really means is that in international law, if you provide material assistance by following orders, you could be prosecuted for it. And we have seen actions across the world where people have refused in some states to assist in the armament of Israel by, for example, taking union action and striking, where their infrastructure is one where they know that the planes that are going to fly out are providing weapons to Israel. And so that type of issue is really important for individuals, and they have to make a decision as to whether or not they're prepared to participate in those types of crimes.
Thank you. Is there anyone else that would like to respond before we continue? All right, thank you. So I do see that we have quite a few journalists, but in terms of questions, I think perhaps people would like to say some of those until the end. And so we're going to continue with our speakers. And we're going to be hearing from Hamam Farah, who is a psychotherapist, writer, and activist based in Toronto. Welcome, Hamam.
Hi, thank you, Bianca. So I'm here to talk about my family's experience of this horrific atrocity we're watching on our screens. So my family is from the Palestinian Christian community in Gaza, the Christian minority there, and not many of us are left since 1948. Most of our lands have been confiscated and stolen by the Israeli military and the Israeli government over the decades. So, but we remain a small minority there, and now family members are trying to and desperately asking to be able to come here to Canada to take refuge. But when these murders started happening and Israel launched its attack on Gaza and after October 7th, my family quickly, for the first time, they never really had to leave their homes in previous attacks on Gaza, but this time it was imminent that Israel was going to come to Gaza City. And that's where my family is located, in the middle of Gaza City. So they had to leave their homes and they went to seek shelter at the St. Porphyrius Orthodox Church, where many others, Muslims and Christians, took refuge in that church. And on October, I believe it was October 19th, that the St. Porphyrius Church was bombed, and the room that my family was staying in collapsed. The ceiling collapsed on top of them. There were many injuries, and there were about, I think, 16 to 18 deaths. And one of those deaths was my step-cousin, Sulaiman. Sulaiman was beloved in the community. He was well known. He was very kind and generous, and he would do people favors all the time. And he was the one that was helping the family, move things around and support them in the tasks that needed to be done as they were fleeing their homes. Sulaiman was also driving my aunt, my mother's younger sister. He was driving her to feed her dog and cats, where her dog and cats were left at the house. So they were risking their lives every other day or so, driving from the church to her house to feed the pets. And my aunt was saying how the dog has gone mad from all the sounds of the bombings and the fear. And then when the church was bombed and the ceiling collapsed, Sulaiman, he has two sons, two little boys, and his wife, Lily. His wife has been injured severely. She has a broken back, a broken jaw, broken hip. She was transferred to one of the hospitals, and Al Ahli Hospital, the hospital that was bombed, where that horrific massacre occurred of hundreds of people. So she was transferred there, and she's still there today. There is no medicine, pain medication. There's no medical equipment to operate on her. So she's suffering. Any slight movement she makes is causing her a great deal of pain. When the ceiling collapsed, and the rescuers, the others came to rescue the victims, and Sulaiman was pulled out. Sulaiman still had his son in his arms, one of his sons in his arms. And I don't know if his son was conscious to witness this happen, but Sulaiman was alive at the time. He was still alive. And the rescuers were able to get his son out of his hands. And when they did that and they turned around to come get Sulaiman, the floor collapsed from under Sulaiman. I believe this was the second floor. And he fell with the rocks toppling all over him and was killed. So I don't know how his son is going to be bearing with this trauma for the rest of his life. And then that, maybe some of you have watched the funerals of the people in that church, and you see the Christian Orthodox priests presiding over the bodies and giving the funeral ceremony. And I saw the footage. I saw my other relatives there and many other people in the community, and there was an outpouring of support, of course. And then I saw in that footage one of my other relatives who is very noticeable. She's quite distinct from the way she dresses, always trying to look chic and dress up for any occasion, I guess including this one too. But her name is Ilham, and she's my great aunt. She's my mother's aunt, my late grandmother's younger sister. And she was apparently well known throughout the whole Gaza community. Like, everybody knew her, and she was quite popular from just the way she dresses, the way she carries herself. She was very stubborn, very fierce, very outspoken in what she liked to do and where she liked to go, and very social. She would show up at all the events, whether she was invited or not. She was one of those relatives, quite feisty, and quite popular. And I'm holding a lot of guilt right now because she's also the type of relative, if you answer her call, she'll just keep calling you every other day. And to my regret, my deep regret, I didn't answer her last calls to me, which was a while ago, before this started. Otherwise, obviously, I would have answered. But I ignored her last calls to me, and so I'll have to live with that guilt for now, and find a way to forgive myself for that. But she couldn't stand being sheltered at the church. This was just last week, and so she didn't listen to anyone telling her that she should stay. She found a ride by herself to take her back to her house. And the driver couldn't go beyond a certain point. He said it was too dangerous to keep driving. I'll have to let you off here, drop you off here. I imagined her saying, "To hell with you," as she walked out of the car and started to make her way to her house. And just before she got to her house, a sniper shot her below the knee in her leg. And she fell, couldn't walk, took out her phone, called her relatives back at the church. And our relatives called her neighbors, and her neighbors said that everybody can see her in the neighborhood. She's out in the open, but no one is able to go out and get her because of the snipers in the area and the shooting that was happening in the area earlier. So they were terrified to go out and help my great aunt. And we then learned that when Palestinians are shot in the leg below the knee, it's a deliberate tactic to not kill the victim, but to maim them so that fighters in the area are lured out to try to come to the rescue of that civilian. And then the Israeli army could kill those fighters. But obviously anybody who was going to try to rescue her was putting themselves in great danger. My family appealed to the Red Cross to get permission from the Israeli military to get her body. There was no response. The Red Cross said that even the bodies that they knew were dead, they weren't able to go and obtain. And then the next morning, my mother called me and said that my great aunt had passed, that there was a fierce battle in the area had erupted between resistance fighters and the Israeli army. And the whole neighborhood was forced to flee their homes. And as the neighbors ran away, they went to my great aunt to help her, and they found that she had died. She had bled out to death. I believe her body's still there. No one's been able to get it until today, and that's the story. Now we have to live with this, and I mean, my story is one of thousands of people now. 11,000 people have now been killed in this genocidal campaign on the people of Gaza. I hold Prime Minister Trudeau and the Canadian government responsible for aiding and abetting this genocide. I hope that the justice can be served here, and that we can find a path to bring those responsible to justice, including officials from the Canadian government who are not only aiding and abetting this genocide, but that have supported and backed the Israeli government for years and years and for decades. This is a government that has not responded to any of our calls for justice, calls for meaningful intervention into the atrocities that the Israeli state has committed against the Palestinian people over the years, and intervention into the never-ending military occupation that's been going on since 1967, and the forced displacement of our people for 75 years since 1948. Millions of Palestinian refugees are in the diaspora and languishing in refugee camps, waiting still for the right to return home, the UN enshrined right under UN Resolution 194. And we still wait for justice today. So I hope that this could be a meaningful step towards that for our people and for peace in the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Hammam. It's hard to know what to say, really. This is unspeakably difficult, and I just want to thank you for somehow finding the strength to share your story and the tragedy and to bear witness. I want to acknowledge that both Hammam and Ayman, who will be speaking next, are in a period of deep grief. And again, we're very grateful to have them with us to be able to speak to what is happening on the ground and the human toll. So next up, we'll be hearing from Ayman Ouida, who's a professor in the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences at the University of Sherbrooke. Welcome, Ayman.
Thank you, Bianca. It's going to be difficult to go after the story that Hammam mentioned, as a lot of our stories are very similar and have a deep impact on our emotions. So me and my wife have tens of relatives in Gaza. On October 22nd, my wife lost an entire family from her father's side. The family, comprised of 8 members, including 3 children, were killed when their home was bombed, and they were buried in the rubble for a few days. They were innocent civilians who lived in the south of Gaza, where Israel had repeatedly mentioned their area to be safe. How will my wife and her family hold Israel accountable for the killing of these innocent lives, innocent children? How are the Palestinians going to get justice for the 5,000 children killed in targeted Israeli bombings? We will not take collateral damage as a justification for these barbaric, haphazard killings of beautiful, innocent, full of life children. On my side of the family, I have 9 aunts, 5 uncles, and 48 cousins, all of whom I love so dearly, and I have played with many times with them as a child. I lost contact with nearly all of them due to the cutting of electricity by Israel. Yesterday, I was lucky enough to speak to one of my aunts, Naama, and her son, who's my cousin, Mahmoud. Every time I called my aunt for the last month or so, including yesterday, she sounded broken. She was cold, thirsty, hungry, and in severe back pain as she ran out of medicine. My aunt and cousins were poor before the war and barely had food at home. After 30 days of bombing near their home, along with intense fear and lack of food, they came to the conviction that the entire world had abandoned them. No food was coming into Gaza, no water, no medicine. They were forced to flee to the south of Gaza. My 70 years old aunt had to walk for 5 hours, tripping and suffering the whole way through. For 5 hours, she, along with my cousin's young children, walked and walked and walked, seeing dead bodies and limbs as they walked along. No child, no one should ever have to go through what they went through. My cousin's wife has multiple sclerosis. His mother-in-law has breast cancer, and her treatment was stopped because of Israel's bombings near the hospitals. His daughter is 8 and his son is 7, and they both missed their home. Last time I spoke to them yesterday, his son Adam looks at me, he's 7 years old, and says, "I'm tired, I'm hungry, and I want to go home." My heart is already shattered into pieces, knowing his home has likely been bombed by now. But I have to pick up myself and tell him, "It's almost over, Adam. It's almost over. A few more days, and you'll go back home." I've been saying this to him for 2 weeks now. The few days have not finished, and there's no end in sight. My cousin waits for hours every day just to get his kids a few loaves of bread. Besides the nearly 5,000 children that have been killed by Israel, doesn't our government see the hundreds of thousands of children and the elderly and the sick and the frail who are in severe distress, who need their medicine, who are in pain? How can my Prime Minister go to a comfortable bed at night and eat warm meals, knowing that millions in Gaza cannot because he is complicit with Israel's war crimes? How can my Prime Minister forgive himself every time he wakes up and goes to bed, knowing that he did not stand up for justice and call for a ceasefire? This is not the Prime Minister I voted into office. This is not the Canada I call home. With the flick of a button, Israel can provide life-saving electricity back to the hospitals. With the flick of a button, Israel can provide water to all the thirsty children and the patients requiring dialysis. With a quick phone call, Israel can allow the entry of food and medicine into Gaza. We've all seen the lines of trucks at the Rafah border, just waiting for that signal from Israel to go into Gaza. But Israel is not doing that. Israel had decided long ago to collectively punish all Gazans. Israel has decided to level entire neighborhoods, knowing fully that children are playing outside or sleeping in their homes. Israel couldn't have done this without the approval of its allies, including Canada. There is so much more my Prime Minister and his cabinet could have done for Gaza. But today, I'm asking for only one thing: ceasefire now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Amen. Thank you so much. Our hearts are with you. Thank you for sharing this devastating story of your family's loss. We need to hear this. It's beyond devastating. Truly, truly, truly heartbreaking. Thank you for raising the issue of complicity. Thank you for being here. The next speaker and our final speaker today is Dr. Susan Power, who is the head of legal research and advocacy at Al-Haq, an independent Palestinian NGO based in Ramallah, West Bank. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to speak. And I just want to start by just extending my deepest condolences to Ayman and Haman on the call for the loss of lives and the horrendous tragedies that have been visited on their families. Just to give, I'm here today representing Al-Haq, and just to give some context into the work of Al-Haq. Al-Haq was established in 1979 to monitor and document violations of human rights and humanitarian law against the Palestinian people, regardless of the perpetrator. Since October the 7th, we've merged a number of our units with two Palestinian human rights organizations in Gaza on the ground, with the Al-Mizan Center for Human Rights and with Palestinian Center for Human Rights. For the first 2 weeks, we were producing daily reports from the field, but due to the intensity of the attacks, our joint field team were unable to continue doing the daily field reports. And this is the first time in the history of our organizations that we've been unable to monitor and document the situation unfolding on the ground in the way that we would usually do because of the intensity and the gravity and the nature and scale of the attacks. Our field researcher in Gaza City, Mohammed, his house was bombed, and then when he fled to his sister's, to his wife's sister's house, that too was bombed. We've been unable to contact Mohammed for the last week, and we're very concerned as to his safety. Our field researcher in the south of the Gaza Strip, his sister's house was bombed, and 3 of her children were killed, and she was left in a seriously critical condition. Our legal researcher in The Hague, Ahmed, his family are from Gaza, and his six members of his extended family were killed, including his 4-year-old nephew. So this has had a very deep impact on everybody that we know. And I just want to kind of pull it back a little bit to 1948, and really since the start of the foundation of the State of Israel, we've seen Israel apply a regime, an apartheid regime, over the Palestinian people. So over the Palestinian people, both in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Gaza Strip, but all Palestinians, Palestinian citizens of Israel, and Palestinian refugees and exiles in the diaspora. It has fragmented the Palestinian people and continued to dominate them and control their lives, subjugate them under discriminatory laws. And it does this to carry out a colonization of the territory. It does this to fragment them and divide them so they cannot resist the ongoing colonization of their lands, their displacement, and their replacement with Israeli Jewish settlers. And what we're seeing at the moment right across the occupied Palestinian territory is a continuation of that colonization. And this is happening now at an accelerated rate since October the 7th. Since October the 7th, and I look just more specifically not to the Gaza Strip, but to the rest of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. And in the rest of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, since October the 7th, there's already been the killing of 193 Palestinians, including 52 children. There's also been an acceleration and an escalation on the ground. There is military incursions into Jenin on November the 9th. Israeli undercover units raided Jenin with armoured bulldozers, where they ripped up through the streets. They carried out drone strikes, and 14 Palestinians were killed, including 4 children. Again, on the 13th and the 14th of November, there was raids and airstrikes on Tulkarem refugee camp in the West Bank, and there was another 7 Palestinians killed in those raids. The Israeli forces prevented ambulances from attending the scene. There's been widespread collective punishment across the West Bank since October 7th. There's been mass arrests and detentions, and so far 2,570 Palestinians have been arrested and detained. 2 of these are members of the Palestinian Legislative Council, so they're parliamentarians, and also the human rights activist Ahed Tamimi was arrested. There's been a widespread movement of movement restrictions at checkpoints, delays right across the West Bank. There's been a curfew placed in the old city of Hebron, and people within the old city are held under curfew and can only go out for 1 hour every 48 hours. They were threatened with evictions if they broke the curfew. And what we're really seeing right across the board in the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, is an acceleration of Israel's forceful transfer measures for colonization. This is a continuation of the colonization. In Gaza, there's a transfer of 1.1 million Palestinians from the north to the south of the Gaza Strip. And there's also plans to force their transfer out of the Gaza Strip altogether into the Sinai, into tent cities. This is also happening, this Gaza Nakba. We're seeing this in the West Bank as well, and this continuing practice of forcible transfer. In the West Bank, we're seeing very aggravated and serious levels of settler violence, and so violent and vicious that it's creating an environment of terror and forcing the displacement of Palestinian communities. the Israeli Minister of National Security has authorized these squadrons of volunteers who are trained and given arms. They're basically militia units. There's 33 of them that have just been formed in Jerusalem, and more that have been formed right across Israel. And these units are being armed. In the West Bank on the 11th of October, just in terms of one of these incidents, and there's of many, 8 to 10 masked Israeli settlers with automatic weapons and handguns launched an attack on the village of Kusra. They killed 3 Palestinians, and an Israeli military officer who was with them killed another Palestinian. The next day at the funeral procession was attacked by Israeli settlers again, and 2 more Palestinians were killed, a father and his son. We're also seeing threats and settler violence spiking in East Jerusalem. There was death threats against Sheikh Akrama Sabri, who's the Imam of Al-Aqsa Mosque. And the settler group even published a call detailing the location of his family home. We've also seen settler groups calling for the destruction of the prayer halls at Al-Aqsa Mosque. The settler violence has led to the displacement of 15 Palestinian communities in the West Bank, and there has now been the displacement of 1,149 Palestinians in the West Bank. There's been an increase in house demolitions. There's been 38 house demolitions in the last 5 weeks, and 180 Palestinians have been displaced from those house demolitions. And at the same time, it must be stressed that already this year, Israel had authorized the development of 22 new settlements, and it had authorized 12,855 new settlement units. So what we're seeing is aggravated settler violence, creating panic and terror in Palestinian areas and villages, Palestinians being displaced, and settlers coming in, taking over the territory and advancing the colonization of the territory. And we're seeing this right across the occupied Palestinian territory. This is the end goal for Gaza, the colonization of northern Gaza. This is the end goal for Jerusalem. This is the end goal in the West Bank, the full colonization of the occupied Palestinian territory. This colonization is carried out through the implementation of an apartheid regime. And what we're seeing also at the moment are genocidal acts and the destruction and the calls for the destruction of the Palestinian people. We're very concerned that Canada abstained for a vote in the General Assembly calling for a ceasefire. And we're also particularly concerned that Canada voted against a resolution on the illegality of settlements. And we would remind that Canada would be in breach of its obligations under the Geneva Conventions to which it is a party, and under the Rome Statute to which it is a party as well. There is an obligation and a duty on Canada, once that sound and that alarm on genocide is raised, to do everything in its power to bring that genocide to an end. And that includes calling for a ceasefire. There needs to be full accountability for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. We're very concerned that calls went out from Israel to different countries looking for dual nationals, so people of Canadian and Israeli citizenship, to join the IDF. Many of those who have joined may have carried out war crimes, crimes against humanity, and acts of genocide, and Canada is obligated to prosecute those persons and ensure that they are arrested and prosecuted and held fully accountable. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Susan, for that really important critical analysis and those updates during this unprecedented period over the past few weeks. So Susan was the final speaker of the afternoon. I see that we have journalists from Radio Canada, Global News, CHCH, the Toronto Star, Rabble, Canada Files, and more. Thank you so much for being here and for covering this. If you have any questions, please go ahead and ask them. I see that we have Aidan Jonah from the Canada Files would like to ask a question. I'm going to unmute you now so that you can ask your question.
Thanks there, Bianca. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, fantastic. So my question to the panelists and especially the lawyers is, of course, that Canada has a law against people fighting abroad. Of course, that is the Foreign Enlistment Act that was created mainly actually to prevent Canadians from joining the fight against Franco in Spain. So you have many Canadians that have joined the Israeli Defense Forces. That is, of course, the Israeli state's military. That is obviously a huge role in the genocide against Palestine. So what I'm wondering is, of course, you also had these Canadian state actually flew out some reservists for Israel's military, or people that were going to fight for Israel after October 7th. Is there any consideration to the Canadian government's, willful refusal to actually prosecute around the Foreign Enlistment Act in this in the motion that has been served, or say the broader legal processes that you folks are looking at initiating?
Thank you, Aidan. Would anyone like to take that?
I'm happy to speak to that, Bianca. Thanks, Aidan. And I just wanted to say thank you again to all the fellow panelists and echo Susan's comments, expressing my condolences as well to Ayman and Hamam for the losses that their families have sustained. In terms of the Foreign Enlistment Act in Canada, Canada has completely ignored that legislation when it comes to Israel. It has been brought to the Canadian government's attention. It's been brought to the attention of the Toronto Police that there's entities in Canada, organizations that recruit Canadians to volunteer and accept engagements in the IDF, and to take on tasks that are regularly assigned to soldiers to free up soldiers to go to the front lines and engage in combat. They wear Israeli military uniforms. They live in Israeli military barracks. They clean firearms, tanks. They check ammunition to make sure it's good quality. They perform the exact same duties that soldiers would perform, and they're subject to military rules while they're volunteering there as well. The Canadian government's aware of this. They've refused to prosecute organizations that are blatantly violating Canadian law. And when we attempted to hold one of those organizations accountable, an organization called Sarel Canada, which is part of a larger organization in Israel that was actually founded by someone in the Israeli military and is connected with the Israeli military as well and promoted by it. When we attempted to bring a private prosecution, we were able to have process issued. We were able to have the case commenced and go before the court. But then what ended up happening was that the Crown exercised its discretion and its authority to come in, intervene in the case, take it over, and immediately shut it down. That's what Canada does. When it comes to Israel's military, there is a complete double standard here. And Israeli military recruitment is one of those examples. It's something that we're continuing to look at. We're appealing what happened in that case where the government came in and shut that private prosecution down. But it's very troubling how Canada has this state of exceptionalism when it comes to Israel's armed forces, legal exceptionalism.
Thank you, Shane. Would anyone else like to add on to what Shane has outlined? All right, we have a question from a community member, Michelle Noor, who wants to know what the public can do, what lawyers can do when it comes to this notice and this action. Maybe I'll start with you, Tayyab.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, in the ICJP in London, we are very well connected to all the political parties in the UK and a significant number of members of parliament. And one of the most interesting characteristics of this current conflict was that members of parliament were actually responding to the massive amount of letters and emails and lobbying that normal members of their constituency were doing on them. And I can say to you, it made a huge difference. It made a huge difference. Yesterday in the UK, we had a ceasefire vote in Parliament, which we lost, by the way. So our Houses of Parliament, our MPs decided not to vote for a ceasefire in total, but a significant number of members of Parliament on the shadow front bench resigned to be able to vote in favour of a ceasefire because they felt their constituencies wanted that. And that's really significant. I think members of the public generally can do a number of things, and I'll just list them really quickly. There's resources. Resources are needed by organizations that provide medical aid in the region. That's always needed. Financial resources are also needed by organizations like ICJP and Al-Haq to be able to carry out the really important work that we carry out in trying to prevent this kind of issue and account for this kind of issue. But the most important thing is that to listen and learn to what ICJP, Al-Haq and others are saying and spread that message and make sure that everybody who hears it, understands it, and changes their view from where it might be or supports the position that we take. That's crucial. I sense in this particular conflict a difference. We have had nearly 1 million people last Saturday on the streets in London protesting, and that was replicated in capital cities across the globe last weekend. And I think that we need to keep making that noise, and we need to keep making that pressure.
Thank you. Is there anyone else that would like to speak before we close up for the afternoon? We've come to the end of our time here. I'm so grateful that you were all able to come here and on such short notice. Thank you to our speakers, Shane, Asaf, Tayyab, Ayman, Hammam, Susan. Thanks to journalists for coming out in such good numbers and for the questions that we did receive. Thank you to ICJP for just spearheading this. Thank you to the endorsing organizations, Al-Haq, the Al-Mizan Center for Human Rights, Palestinian Center for Human Rights, Palestinian and Jewish Unity, Independent Jewish Voices Canada, World Beyond War, Toronto, Just Peace Advocates, Canadian Foreign Policy Institute. Please do continue to follow the details of this action as it unfolds. We will be posting a replay of this event on the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute's YouTube this afternoon. So you can rewatch that. You can also find the documents and contact information at the websites of Just Peace Advocates and the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute.